His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born on a forgotten island in the Mediterranean, spoke with an accent, read Plutarch, and dreamed of Rome. 10 years after his first battle, he would become Emperor of France. 20 years later, he would be a prisoner on a distant island. This is the story of a man who broke the old order of Europe and rewrote the rules of war. It is the story of how he rose on the tide of revolution, how he crushed the Austrians in Italy with brilliance, how he faltered in the sands of Egypt, and how he nearly conquered an entire continent. You will witness his triumphs at Austerlitz and Jena, his errors in Spain and Russia, his downfall in Saxony, in Paris and at Waterloo. Why did kings fear him? Why did thousands follow him? Why, 2 centuries later, do people still argue about him as if he were alive? This is not just a biography. It is the path of an emperor, an artillery officer who became a legend. Suggest in the comments topics for new stories and subscribe to the channel. New bedtime stories come out here every day. And now let us return, slowly, to where it all began. The year was 1769. On the island of Corsica, in the town of Ajaccio, within a modest yet respected family of local nobility, a boy was born and given the name Napoleon Bonaparte. The island had only just been annexed by France, and the transition was painful. Corsicans did not see themselves as French. They were proud, freedom-loving, often quick-tempered, and raised on traditions of resistance. Only yesterday, the island had fought for independence under Pascal Paoli. Today, the cannons were silent, and French officials replaced Corsican laws with their own. Napoleon's father, Carlo Buonaparte, came from an old but modest noble lineage. Educated and resourceful, he quickly adapted to the new reality. He travelled to Paris, made connections, and even secured a place in the royal council. Yet for many Corsicans, this was betrayal. In their eyes, Carlo had transformed from a son of the soil into a servant of the occupying regime. But Carlo himself thought differently. He wanted a better future for his children, and it was through his ambition that the Bonaparte family secured the chance to send their eldest son Napoleon to study in France. But Napoleon was not French, neither in spirit nor in tongue. At home, he spoke the Italo-Corsican dialect. His French was poor, coloured by a heavy accent. At the age of 9, when he entered the military school at Brienne, he found himself a stranger. A provincial noble's son with muddy shoes, a sullen face, and a fiery temper. He was poor, proud, and unable to engage in light conversation. His classmates mocked him, called him the little Corsican, ridiculed his accent and his manners, and Napoleon remained silent. Not out of fear, but out of restraint. He was storing it away. With his resentment came concentration. While others played, he read. While others went home for holidays, he stayed behind in the library. In his letters to his parents, he complained of loneliness and the coldness of his companions. But already within him grew a conviction. No one would give him anything. He would take everything himself. He devoured the lives of Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Plutarch's heroes. He copied their deeds, studied their strategies. Even then, he carried the sense that he was not merely a soldier, but someone destined to shape destinies. And so he wrote to himself, silently and firmly, no one will give him anything. He will take it all himself. In those lonely years of schooling, Napoleon clung to heroes who seemed larger than life. Caesar, Alexander the Great, the men whose stories Plutarch immortalized. These became his companions, his guides, his silent tutors. He studied their victories, traced their failures, copied their gestures. Even then he began to sense that he was not merely a soldier. He was a man who would shape destinies. At 15, fate tested him. His father died, leaving the family in poverty. The burden of survival fell upon his mother, Letizia. She was not a woman to mourn or submit. Hard as the Corsican rocks, sharp as salt air, she taught her children that the world was cruel and must be met with iron teeth. From her, Napoleon inherited endurance, severity, and an unyielding sense of duty to family. Even as emperor, he would distribute thrones among his brothers, feeding them crowns as if they were bread. Temporary gifts, but always proof of his obligation. After Brienne came Paris. The military academy there was the highest peak possible for a provincial noble with no fortune. If Brienne had mocked him, Paris despised him. The French aristocracy looked upon him as an exotic, dangerous curiosity. Yet Napoleon found his weapon, and it was knowledge. In mathematics and artillery, his brilliance flared. He was not merely good, he was the best. He graduated first in his class, and with that triumph earned his first commission, second lieutenant of artillery in a regiment stationed in southern France. In Auxonne and Valence he drilled, wrote, and dreamed. His pen turned to Corsica, and his essays sang of freedom, rebellion, and the heroic figure of Pascal Paoli, whom he idolized as martyr and saviour. His words carried fire, but when at last he returned to his island, eager to join the resistance, reality betrayed him. Paoli, once his idol, saw in him not a loyal disciple, but a restless, ambitious young man, too independent, too unpredictable. What began as political differences soon hardened into personal conflict. Napoleon was forced to leave Corsica for good. He returned to France not as a Corsican longing for liberation, but as a man rejected by both his own and the strangers who ruled them. It was then he began to understand. He belonged to no nation. He would belong only to himself. He would become French not by birth, but by conquest. Not because he was born in France, but because he would seize it. And by the time this realization burned fully within him, the ground of France itself was trembling. The king still sat upon his throne, but the soil beneath him was breaking apart. The air carried the scent of revolution, and for men like Napoleon, it meant only one thing: a chance. As the old order collapsed, a new man could rise, not by title, not by blood, not by privilege, but by sheer ability. Beneath the glittering facade of monarchy, France in the late 18th century was rotting from within. The treasury had been drained by endless wars, including costly involvement in the American Revolution. Taxes fell almost entirely on the shoulders of the Third Estate, the peasants, artisans, and common townsfolk. Meanwhile, the clergy and nobility lived untouched, exempt from burdens, cocooned in privilege and influence. The contrast bred anger, resentment, and a gnawing sense of injustice. The monarchy, under Louis XVI, appeared helpless before the storm. Reform after reform failed. The royal court drifted further from reality, while famine spread, inflation rose, and discontent hardened into rage. Enlightenment ideas, once confined to salons of philosophers, now spilled into the streets. People began to ask dangerous questions. What is equality? What is justice? Do we not have the right to shape our nation's fate? The answers came in fire. The storming of the Bastille in July 1789 became more than a battle. It was a symbol. The old order crumbled. The king lost his power, the nobles their lands, the church its influence. From the wreckage of monarchy emerged something wild, uncertain, and new. A republic where everything became possible, both ascent and ruin. For young men like Napoleon Bonaparte, this was not chaos but opportunity. He was only 20 years old when the revolution began, an artillery officer with no wealth, no title, no name of distinction. Under the old world he would have remained an obscure provincial soldier. But the revolution did not merely open doors, it tore down the walls. The army, abandoned by fleeing noble officers, cried out for talent. A vacuum of command awaited those bold enough to fill it. It was here that Bonaparte was noticed. In 1793, the eyes of the Republic turned toward Toulon, a vital port seized by royalist rebels and handed to the British fleet. The siege dragged on. Indecision gnawed at the command and morale ebbed. Then a young artillery captain put forward a plan, daring, sharp, precise. Capture the fort of Les Guillettes, which dominated the harbour. That single bastion controlled the fate of Toulon. Despite his youth, despite his low rank, Bonaparte insisted. He pushed his plan through, and it worked. French troops seized the position, the British fleet abandoned the port, and the city fell. The siege was over. In the aftermath, the Republic rewarded him. He was 24 years old when he was promoted to brigadier general. His name began to echo in Paris. Some hailed him as a genius, a bold tactician, a mind that fused mathematics with firepower. Others whispered warnings. Here was a man too decisive, too independent, too swift in his rise. Already the legend had begun to stir. Napoleon's ascent was accelerated by the shadow of a powerful ally. He gained the support of Augustin Robespierre, brother to Maximilian, the most feared leader of the Jacobins. This protection secured his position, but also placed him in grave danger. For when Robespierre fell in the bloody summer of 1794, all who had walked in his orbit were dragged down with him. Bonaparte was arrested, confined under watch. His career, his freedom, perhaps even his life hung by a thread. Yet the storm of politics shifted quickly, and within months he was released. Instead of glory, he was sent into obscurity, a post in the army's topographical department. His new task was to bend over maps and drafting tables far from the roar of cannons. For Napoleon it was humiliation, a bitter exile into monotony. But he did not break. He waited. He sharpened patience as one sharpens steel. That patience was rewarded. Autumn, 1795. Paris trembled on the brink of counter-revolution. Royalists gathered, ready to march into the city and restore monarchy by force. The Republican government had little strength to oppose them. At that moment, Paul Barras, a key figure in the Directory, remembered the young officer who had saved Toulon. Bonaparte was entrusted with the defence of Paris. He did not hesitate. He ordered artillery to block the city's vital streets and squares, every approach to the centre locked beneath iron muzzles. On the 13th of Vendémiaire, October 5th by the new calendar, the royalist columns advanced. Bonaparte gave the order. Grapeshot thundered into the crowds. Smoke rolled across the boulevards. Panic split the attackers, and their lines dissolved into chaos. The battle ended as quickly as it began. Victory was total. It was ruthless. Napoleon had not bargained, had not stalled. He acted as a soldier, not a politician, and for this Paris rewarded him with recognition. Barras made him a favourite, and soon he was promoted to commander of the internal forces. No longer just a brilliant officer, Napoleon had become a man of true political weight. Those watching his career now understood. This man would climb higher still. Yet his true ascent, his first great campaign, the one that would turn him into the idol of France and the nightmare of Europe, waited for him just across the Alps in Italy. For by then the revolution had spilled beyond France's borders. The execution of Louis XVI in 1793 had transformed it from a domestic upheaval into a continental storm. Europe's monarchies, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Britain and others, saw the new republic as an existential threat. From Paris flowed dangerous ideas: liberty, sovereignty of the people, rejection of kings. To the courts of Europe these were sparks too near dry timber, and so coalition after coalition rose, desperate to extinguish the flame. France stood encircled. From the east pressed the Austrians. At sea ruled the British fleet. To the south the Spaniards threatened. Within the land itself rebellion flared, none more brutal than the insurrection in the Vendée, where peasants rose in rivers of blood. By 1796 the Republic had survived, but it was exhausted. Its economy lay in ruins, its army depleted, its people disillusioned with the faltering Directory. The government needed more than survival. It needed a spark to reawaken faith, to restore initiative. That spark was chosen in Italy. The logic was plain. Austria, France's most dangerous foe on the continent, controlled northern Italy. If the Austrians were forced from those provinces, and their ally Sardinia driven from the war, France could achieve more than military victory. She could plant a chain of sister republics, buffers and reservoirs of resources, feeding men and gold into the veins of the revolution. Yet the army on that front was in miserable condition. Soldiers marched in tattered uniforms, hungry, weakened by disease, broken by neglect. It was into this disheartened host, in March of 1796, that a new commander arrived. He was 26. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not a veteran of grand campaigns. He carried no aristocratic name. But Toulon was his, the defence of Paris was his, and with them a reputation, a man of speed, decision, and fire. From the first day, Bonaparte shattered the habits of mediocrity. He swept aside officers, reshaped the staff, tightened supply, and most of all spoke directly to the soldiers. But his words were not of duty, nor of abstract patriotism. He spoke of glory, of victory, of loot, and the fertile valleys of Italy waiting for them. The effect was electric. Ragged men who had marched on empty stomachs lifted their heads. They no longer saw an aloof commander. They saw a leader who promised triumph, a guide who would pull them out of misery into greatness. By April, the army was in motion. Napoleon's strategy was unlike the cautious doctrines of his age. He did not delay. He did not wait for reinforcements. He struck first, and he struck fast. He tore apart enemy alliances, shattering Sardinian and Austrian armies before they could unite. He severed their lines of communication, forced them to fight in fragments, on ground of his choosing. In mere weeks, the king of Piedmont Sardinia begged for peace, dragging his kingdom out of the war. It was Napoleon's first great triumph, but it was only the beginning. For soon came a string of battles, each one another step upward, another rung on the ladder of his fame. At Lodi, that ladder rose higher still. The Austrian army stood across the river Adda, its artillery guarding a narrow bridge that seemed impossible to cross. To advance meant death. Yet Napoleon ordered the assault. He himself led the grenadiers, charging into a storm of fire. His courage electrified the soldiers. The bridge was taken, the enemy thrown back. Years later, Napoleon would confess. At Lodi, he first felt not merely a commander of battles, but a master of history itself. The test of Arcole came next. The landscape was swamp and mire, battalions scattered, artillery dragged by hand through sucking mud. Yet Napoleon bound the army together, once again placing himself in the thick of the fight. In the crucial moment he seized a flag, rushed forward across the bridge beneath a hail of bullets. He was nearly killed. He fell into the river, but the soldiers surged after him, driven by his defiance. The enemy broke. The victory was not won by numbers, but by will. The crescendo of the Italian campaign came at Rivoli. The Austrians hurled their strength to break the siege of Mantua. Outnumbered, the French clung to the high ground, using the ridges as weapons, striking with precision from the flanks. For 2 days the struggle raged. When it ended, the Austrian army lay shattered. Thousands of prisoners, cannons, banners taken. Mantua soon surrendered. Italy fell under French control. Yet Bonaparte's vision reached beyond the battlefield. Victory in arms was only half the plan. He began reshaping Italy itself into a new political order. Sister republics sprang up: the Cisalpine, the Ligurian, the Roman. In name, they were independent states, baptized in the ideals of liberty and equality. In truth, they were puppets of France, feeding her with recruits, money and supplies. The army lived off the land. France's coffers filled with Italy's treasures. Masterpieces of painting, sculpture, manuscripts and ancient coins were shipped to Paris. The Louvre, future temple of art, was built upon these spoils. Officially it was the liberation of culture. To many it looked like systematic plunder. After Mantua's fall and Austria's defeats, the Habsburg throne itself trembled. Napoleon advanced toward Vienna. But in Paris, men of power grew uneasy. His victories were too great, his fame too swift. They ordered him to halt. Negotiations began. In October 1797 at Campo Formio, peace was signed. Austria recognized all French conquests in Italy and surrendered lands along the Rhine. For the first time since the Revolution, the Republic stood with a complete formal victory. Napoleon returned to France in triumph. His name was on every tongue, even among those who cared nothing for politics. He was the Republic's hero, the symbol of a new epoch, a man whose will and daring had proved stronger than the old empires of Europe. But already, in his restless mind, another vision took shape. An expedition unlike any before. Not in Europe, not in Vienna. He dreamed of Egypt. By the spring of 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte's name resounded across France like the tolling of a great bell. He was the hero of Italy, the liberator, the maker of republics, the general who had never lost. But glory is a double-edged sword. The brighter he shone in the eyes of the people, the darker his shadow loomed in the minds of those who still clung to power. The Directory, rulers in name but weak in truth, grew wary. They saw in Napoleon not just a victorious general, but a potential usurper, a man who might sweep them aside as easily as he had swept Austria from Lombardy. They could not control him, yet they dared not destroy him. The people adored him. The army trusted him. The solution was delicate. They would send him far away, beyond France, beyond Europe itself, an expedition to Egypt. There, far from Paris, he could not threaten their power, and perhaps he could achieve what France desperately desired, a blow against Britain. Invading England directly was impossible. The French fleet was too weak, the risk of ruin too great. But Egypt lay on the road to India, the jewel of Britain's empire. Whoever controlled the Nile controlled the eastern gate of the world. Strike there, and one might strike at Britain's very lifeline. Napoleon accepted at once. He saw not exile but opportunity. To fight in the Orient was to step into legend, to follow in the footsteps of Alexander, whose image had haunted him since boyhood. He dreamed of carrying not just muskets and cannon, but the light of reason into lands he believed sunk in darkness. He would not only conquer, he would civilize. In May 1798, from Toulon, the fleet set sail. A vast armada, more than 400 ships bearing 35,000 soldiers, thousands of horses, cannon, and, most remarkable, 167 scholars. Mathematicians, astronomers, architects, geologists, linguists. It was not merely an army. It was an expedition of enlightenment. They carried printing presses, microscopes, instruments, laboratories. In Egypt they would found an institute that would give birth to modern Egyptology. The first stop was Malta, stronghold of the Knights of St. John. The bastion surrendered without struggle. Napoleon dismantled their order, stripped their privileges, seized supplies, and after a week at harbour, sailed on. Malta was no more than a prelude, a prologue of easy triumph. Egypt was another matter. The land met them with fire, heat, sand, swarms of insects, disease, thirst, and suspicion in the eyes of the people. This was no march through fertile valleys. This was a trial. On July 1st, Napoleon's forces landed near Alexandria. The city fell swiftly, but the true road led inland, across the desert toward Cairo. So the army turned south, hugging the Nile as lifeline and road. Weeks later, they reached Emba Bay, and beyond it, a plain that would echo forever in memory. It was the field of the pyramids. The Mamluks, the warrior caste who ruled Egypt in the name of the Ottoman Empire, gathered their strength to meet the invaders. Over 20,000 men, horsemen, musketeers, artillery, assembled on the plain. Against them Napoleon arrayed his troops in carrés, hollow squares of infantry, with cannon bristling from the corners, formations that could repel attacks from every side. Before the battle began, he spoke words that would be remembered for centuries. 40 centuries looked down upon you from the heights of these pyramids. It was not mere theatrics. Napoleon knew how to ignite hearts, and the soldiers advanced with the feeling that they were no longer men of flesh but instruments of destiny. The battle raged for hours. Wave after wave of Mamluk cavalry thundered against the squares. French artillery tore through the charges, musket volleys held the lines firm. By evening the plain lay strewn with bodies. The Mamluks were broken. The road to Cairo was open. Within days the city surrendered. Napoleon entered as a liberator. He addressed the people in the language of Islam, calling himself a friend of Muslims and an enemy of the Mamluks. He issued proclamations declaring that he came not as conqueror, but as saviour. Yet the people of Cairo remained wary. They did not trust the foreign soldiers, nor the alien faith of their leader. Suspicion turned to unrest, and unrest to rebellion. Meanwhile, on the waters of the Mediterranean, disaster struck. On August 1st, 1798, Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay. At nightfall, he attacked with audacity, steering his ships between the French line and the shore, breaking every rule of naval combat. By dawn, the French fleet was annihilated. Ships burned, exploded, or were captured. Only fragments survived. The army in Egypt was cut off. No communication with France, no reinforcements, no escape. What had begun as a vision of empire now threatened to become a gilded trap. And yet Napoleon did not yield to despair. He turned his will inward, seizing control of the land itself. He created councils of administration, built fortifications, passed laws forbidding looting. He founded the Institut d'Egypte, a scientific body devoted to exploration and study. Scholars catalogued plants, mapped the Nile, studied ancient monuments. It was during this time that they uncovered the Rosetta Stone, carved with 3 scripts, which would one day unlock the mystery of Egyptian hieroglyphs. But alongside the light of knowledge came the shadow of blood. In Cairo, revolt erupted. The streets surged with men carrying knives and pikes. French patrols were butchered, storehouses set aflame. Napoleon's answer was merciless. He ordered cannon fire into the crowded quarters. Suspected conspirators were executed without trial. The repression was ruthless, but for a time it restored control. Yet the silence of Cairo was not peace. It was the hush of a city waiting for the next storm, and the storm came. In early 1799, Napoleon turned his gaze beyond the Nile. To secure Egypt, he believed, he must strike first. He marched his army into Syria, determined to crush Ottoman forces before they could invade. At Jaffa, his troops fought bitterly, seizing the city with heavy losses. But beyond Jaffa lay Acre, ancient fortress on the Mediterranean shore. There, the advance faltered. The Turkish garrison, reinforced by the guns of the British fleet, held fast. One assault followed another. Each time French soldiers fell beneath the walls. Disease crept through the camp. Water ran short, powder dwindled, and the engines of war broke down. For the first time in his life, Napoleon met an obstacle he could not break. Acre did not fall. Defeated, he turned back across the desert, carrying with him the bitter taste of retreat. He returned to Egypt with the knowledge that victory was slipping from his grasp. The expedition that had begun as a vision of empire was crumbling into stalemate. Worse still, he sensed that his presence in Africa no longer served France. Across the sea, Paris was convulsed by scandal, its government unravelling. The Directory was weak, distrusted and despised. So he made a decision, one of the boldest of his life. He would abandon Egypt. In September 1799, leaving the army under General Kleber, Napoleon boarded a small vessel and set sail for home. The journey was perilous. The Mediterranean swarmed with British ships, but fortune favoured him. The vessel slipped through patrols, and by October his boots touched French soil once more. In Paris, rumours had painted him as dead, lost in the sands. His return was sudden, almost spectral, as if he had stepped back from the grave. Behind him lay an army stranded in the desert. Before him lay a nation drowning in chaos. He did not return as a commander of expeditions. He returned as a man ready to claim power. By the autumn of 1799, France was not the land he had left. In his absence, it had sunk deeper into crisis. The war with the coalition dragged on, consuming men and treasure. The provinces starved of resources, the capital stifled in intrigue. The Directory, that Council of Five, had no trust, no strength, no vision. Corruption corroded its core. Generals acted as warlords, provinces as petty states. The revolution's fire had burned down to ash. The people hungered for change. They were weary of slogans, weary of terror, weary above all of weakness. And into this void stepped a figure the public had not forgotten. The conqueror of Italy. the victor at the pyramids, the general already whispered to be another Caesar. Crowds gathered to glimpse his carriage. Newspapers hailed him as saviour. Politicians schemed to wield him as a sword, or to channel his ambition. But Napoleon was no longer the youthful general chasing glory across Lombardy. He had become something else. He had become a man convinced of his destiny. That conviction soon became action. The plot was carefully woven, drawing in men of influence and calculation. His brother Lucien Bonaparte, president of the Council of 500, lent both political cover and organisational skill. The Minister of War, Roger Ducos, stood with them. Their plan was simple, almost elegant, to use the people's discontent and the army's loyalty to execute a bloodless coup, wrapped in the language of constitutional defence. The date was set, 9th of November 1799, or in the revolutionary calendar, the 18th of Brumaire, year 8. The deputies of the legislative councils were summoned to Saint-Cloud, a safe remove from restless Paris. They were told of a conspiracy threatening the Republic and assured that for their safety, the vote must be held away from the capital. Everything bore the appearance of legality, but beneath the cloak of concern lay the cold geometry of power. Napoleon entered the halls at Saint-Cloud with grenadiers at his side. He attempted to address the chambers, but his words stumbled. The speech was confused, uncertain, accusatory. Deputies expected clarity and conviction. Instead, they heard threats. Murmurs rose to shouts. In the Council of 500, voices cried out, "Outlaw him! Dictatorship!" Tension swelled to violence. One deputy rushed at Bonaparte. Soldiers pulled him away under guard. The coup teetered on collapse, and then Lucien rose. Climbing the rostrum, he unsheathed his sword, lifted it to the chamber, and declared that his brother was no traitor but the saviour of the Republic. If Napoleon should betray liberty, Lucien vowed, he himself would strike the blow. It was theatre of the highest order. The soldiers outside were summoned in, marched into the chamber, and swept the deputies from their seats. The seizure of power was bloodless, but shadowed with menace. The next day, a new order was proclaimed. The consulate. Officially, it was a restoration of stability, a government of 3 consuls, equal in title. But from the beginning, there was no equality. Sieyès and Ducos receded into insignificance. All real power flowed to Napoleon. He dissolved the Council of 500, replacing it with a compliant Senate. He restored discipline to the army. He reformed the administration, weaving France into a fabric of centralization. The revolution's chaos was ending, not in anarchy, but in authority. The people, weary of turmoil, accepted it almost with relief. More than that, they welcomed it. Newspapers hailed him as the man who could end the revolution at last. His image held contradictions. The general of Republican battles, the liberator of Italy, the victor of the pyramids, now the architect of order. He did not erase the gains of the revolution. The civil code, freedom of conscience, reforms in education, these he preserved. And thus, in Napoleon's hands, France began to change shape once more. But under his control, the old freedoms dissolved. No longer did men speak of popular sovereignty. They spoke instead of stability, of discipline, of the grandeur of the state. Formally, he was still first consul. In reality, he was already the ruler of France. In his chambers, laws were drafted. With his signature, offices were filled. By his will, destinies were shaped. Thus the long night of revolutionary chaos ended, and a new chapter began, the era of one man's power. He had not yet taken a crown, but the nation itself rested in his hands. The first years after the coup of Brumaire seemed almost miraculous, after a decade of revolution, terror, civil war and political experiment. For the first time in years, France breathed order. At the helm stood a man who acted swiftly, firmly, imposing discipline not only on his army but on the machinery of state itself. Napoleon poured his energy into rebuilding governance. He reformed administration, erecting a strict vertical of authority. He created prefects to rule over departments, restored funding to the courts, and reasserted central power. In 1800 he founded the Bank of France. stabilising the fragile finances of the Republic. Taxes were unified, weights and measures standardised, and the first great codifications of law began. Everything in his governance followed a single logic: order, efficiency, centralised control. Yet he did not discard the revolution's gains. He transformed them. Freedom of religion, secular schools, the abolition of feudal privilege, equality before the law, all were preserved, but no longer as fiery ideals. They became the building blocks of a rational, enduring state. It was no longer about sovereignty of the people. It was about the strength of power that could hold France together. By 1802, the people had grown accustomed to this new order. A plebiscite was held. Should Napoleon Bonaparte be made consul for life? The official results were nearly unanimous, but the numbers mattered little. The true meaning was elsewhere. France no longer resisted the rule of one man. On the contrary, it desired it. In that acceptance, another thought ceased to seem heretical: the restoration of monarchy. Not a return to the Bourbons, not a crown of the past, but something new. Napoleon would not be King of France. That title was too old, too tainted. He sought another, a new name, a new image, a new system. France did not need a monarch of tradition. It needed a founder of destiny. And in 1804, the decision was made. Napoleon would become Emperor of the French. Yet even as the preparations for coronation advanced, another story lingered in the shadows. His personal life, begun long before the imperial crown. It was the story of Josephine de Beauharnais, the woman who stood beside him from the beginning. She was 6 years his elder, born on Martinique, widowed by the guillotine, raising 2 children alone. She had suffered, endured, and yet risen to a place of respect within Parisian society. By the time they met in 1795, she was already a lady of influence, graceful, perceptive, elegant in her manners, and capable of bending even the harshest adversary to her charm. Napoleon fell in love with her with the same force that he launched armies. His letters, burning with passion, reveal not the cold strategist of the battlefield, but a man consumed by tenderness, longing, and jealousy. In the spring of 1796, just days before he departed for Italy, they married. It was a union of impulse. He sought love, she sought protection. From the beginning, their life together was filled with quarrels, suspicions, reconciliations, and yet they remained bound to each other. Josephine accompanied him in the salons of Paris, tempered his storms of temper, and softened the edges of political intrigues. She was at his side in triumphs and in moments of near ruin. She gave him something no general, no minister, no soldier could: acceptance in society's circles, and a touch of human warmth in his iron world. When Napoleon became first consul, he did not push her aside. He strengthened her place. Despite their childless union, despite rumours and criticisms, he kept her near. And when the hour of coronation approached, he made his choice. She must be part of it. He could have crowned himself alone, but chose instead to share the symbol with her. On December 2nd, 1804, Paris witnessed a spectacle greater than anything since the Bourbons. Beneath the Gothic vaults of Notre Dame, the cathedral was filled with senators, generals, diplomats, scholars, and artists. At the altar sat Pope Pius VII, summoned to lend divine legitimacy to the moment. Yet the true authority lay not in Rome's hands, but in Napoleon's. When the time came, he refused to kneel before the Pope. He walked to the altar, lifted the crown himself, and placed it upon his own head. The gesture was deliberate, calculated, unforgettable. Power, he declared, came not from tradition, not from church or dynasty, but from himself. Then he turned to Josephine. With equal solemnity, he set a crown upon her brow, making her Empress of the French. It was more than personal recognition. It was the public consecration of her place in the empire he had built. Despite the doubts, despite the absence of an heir, he bound her into the ritual of sovereignty. The coronation ended with choirs, fanfares, prayers. As the couple left the cathedral, Paris saw a new form of power, not a king by birth, but an emperor by act. a man who had not inherited a throne, but constructed one with his own hands. After that moment, France was no longer a republic in disguise. It became, openly and undeniably, an empire. The very language of government changed. The army was renamed imperial. The Minister of the Interior was transformed into a grand officer of the empire. Senators became pillars of the new regime. Institutions that had been born of revolution were reshaped into instruments of central will. Napoleon's empire was not a restoration of the Bourbons, nor was it a continuation of revolutionary chaos. It was something third, something new, a system where law bent to the hand of power, and order itself became legitimacy. What only yesterday had seemed wild or impossible, crowns, regalia, titles, now appeared natural. The people accepted this transformation because it worked, because it gave results. Europe hesitated, but France followed the man it had raised to the summit, and so by 1805 the empire stood steady. Its ruler, freshly crowned, held not only the symbolic weight of sovereignty, but also the hard levers of governance: stability, centralization, reform, a loyal army, a revived economy. Outwardly there was quiet, but beneath that quiet shadows gathered. For Napoleon's coronation had been more than spectacle. To the monarchies of Europe it was a challenge. In London, in St. Petersburg, in Vienna, the act was taken as an insult, a threat. They had once struggled against a chaotic republic. Now they faced a disciplined empire. Legitimacy itself seemed to have shifted, from divine right to the will of a nation and the genius of a soldier. To kings this was more than troubling, it was dangerous. The first to stiffen in resistance was Britain, the one European power that had never truly made peace with France. The brief truce of Amiens, broken after scarcely a year, gave way once more to blockade. British ships sealed French ports, their spies multiplied across Europe, and their diplomats stitched together a new coalition. Austria was quick to join, eager to erase the humiliation of Italy and regain lost lands. Russia too, under the young Tsar Alexander I, pledged men and steel. More than 100,000 soldiers would march west to link with allies in Central Europe. Britain provided gold, Austria, armies, Russia, sheer numbers. Each power had its own motives, but they shared a single goal: to stop Napoleon from becoming master of the continent. And so, swiftly, the Third Coalition was born. Napoleon studied its shape with a cold, precise eye. He knew that hesitation would mean encirclement. Delay would deliver France into the jaws of its enemies. His army, gathered for years along the Channel coast at Boulogne, had been trained and prepared for an invasion of Britain. But when it became clear that the struggle would not be fought at sea, Napoleon turned with breathtaking speed. The invasion fleet was abandoned. His gaze fixed instead upon the heart of Europe, Germany. What followed astonished even his most seasoned marshals. In a matter of weeks, the entire host was on the march. More than 200,000 men, forged into what he would call the Grande Armée, flowed across the Rhine. Their movements were measured like clockwork, their columns advancing along carefully drawn paths, avoiding battle until the moment of certainty arrived. The goal was clear: crush the Austrian army before Russian reinforcements could arrive. General Karl Mack concentrated his forces near the city of Ulm, believing the French would come too late. He hoped to hold his ground until allies joined him, but Napoleon had written another script. Rather than hurl his men headlong at Austrian defences, he unfolded a dance of manoeuvres. His columns swung wide, encircled from the north, crossed the Danube and sealed the city tight. Ulm was a trap. The Austrians tried to break free, but every escape was blocked. On October 20th, 1805, after desperate attempts, Mack surrendered. 25,000 soldiers laid down arms. Napoleon had won without a great battle, victory achieved through speed, precision, and the harmony of movement. The road to Vienna lay open. In November, Napoleon entered the Austrian capital. Yet the war was not done. The real weight of the coalition still pressed forward. Russian troops under Kutuzov and the young Tsar Alexander I, together with the remnants of Austria's shattered army, drew back into Moravia. Napoleon knew his position was dangerous. His army was weary, stretched thin across conquered lands. Every day of delay invited new threats. Prussia's intervention, uprisings in his rear, the slow strangling of momentum. Only one answer remained: a single, decisive blow. He chose the plateau near the town of Austerlitz. Here he prepared a masterpiece. To lure the enemy, he feigned weakness. He thinned his right flank, let his troops be seen withdrawing, creating the illusion of fragility. The bait was set. At dawn, December the 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation, the battle began. Mist veiled the fields. The Allied army moved exactly as he wished, striking at the weakened flank. Their strength flowed into the trap, and when they were committed, Napoleon unleashed his strike. French corps surged forward into the centre, storming the Pratzen heights. The Allied army was torn in two. From that moment the battle flowed swift and unstoppable. The Allied centre collapsed in confusion. Their flanks dissolved into panic. French guns thundered against the retreating columns, tearing order into fragments. At the ponds near the village of Satchen, Russian and Austrian troops tried to flee across the frozen surface. Under the roar of artillery, the ice cracked and shattered. Hundreds of men plunged into the dark water. Cannons, horses, soldiers, all sank beneath the breaking sheets of ice. By evening, the field belonged to Napoleon. The Allies had lost more than 30,000 killed, wounded, or captured. French losses were 3 times smaller. The young Tsar Alexander fled in shock, shaken by the weight of his first great defeat. Emperor Francis of Austria, abandoned and exposed, sued for peace. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed in December 1805, confirmed the scale of France's triumph. Austria withdrew from the coalition, surrendered claims to Italy and Germany, paid heavy indemnities, and ceded swathes of territory. France stood supreme, the preeminent power in Europe. Yet Napoleon did not stop at peace. He sought to redraw the map itself. In the following year, under French protection, he forged the Confederation of the Rhine, 16 German states that abandoned the Holy Roman Empire. With that, an order that had endured for nearly 1,000 years came to an end. Emperor Francis renounced his ancient title. The system of feudal loyalties that had bound Central Europe dissolved like mist at dawn. From now on, the map of Europe would not be dictated by traditional papal decree. It would be drawn in the headquarters of the French army, confirmed in the halls of the Tuileries, and sealed on treaties dictated to the vanquished. The Battle of Austerlitz was not merely a victory of arms. It was the moment Napoleon's image crystallized, as a man who reshaped the world not only with the sword, but with calculation and vision. His empire no longer seemed a passing anomaly. It became the new normal. To some, an object of awe. To others, a source of dread. After the crushing of the Third Coalition, after Austerlitz and the birth of the Confederation of the Rhine, France entered a new phase. A phase of consolidation, of institution, of permanence. Military victory gave political dominance, but Napoleon sought more. He wanted his power to be felt not only on the battlefield, but in the everyday lives of millions. At this height, the empire reached its greatest inner stability. The state's mechanisms were in motion, the army strong, the finances secure, the people largely loyal. But beneath the surface, calm ran ceaseless work. The slow transformation of revolutionary chaos into a centralized hierarchy, bound to one will. The chief instrument of this transformation lay in administrative reforms, begun under the consulate, now completed under the empire. France was carved into departments, each one governed by a prefect appointed from Paris. These men were not elected, owed no loyalty to local elites, and answered only to the central will. They oversaw taxes, schools, policing, construction, and the fragile fabric of public order. Beneath them worked sub-prefects, mayors, and councillors, none chosen by citizens, all imposed from above. The democratic fragments the revolution had once tried to preserve were swept away. Power no longer rose from below. It descended clear and heavy from above, direct, unquestionable, absolute. But this new pyramid of authority required a foundation. That foundation was law. And here Napoleon gave the world his greatest legacy, the Code Napoleon. Drafted under the consulate and published in 1804, it grew in the years that followed, expanded and refined. It was more than a collection of statutes. It was a declaration of principle, a statement of civilization. The code enshrined equality before the law, sanctity of property, freedom of contract, civil marriage, and secular responsibility. It swept away feudal distinctions, abolished privileges of birth, and unified judicial practice. It gave men mastery in the family and placed civic life under the eye of the state. Women were bound to husbands, divorce restricted, paternal power absolute. To jurists, it was a leap forward. To politicians, it was an instrument of legitimacy. For now the empire possessed not only armies and crowns, but a legal bedrock, rational, uniform, binding from Lille to Marseille. And it did not stop at France's borders. The code travelled with the eagles. It took root in Italy, in Belgium, in the Confederation of the Rhine. It became a symbol of the French model of civilization, secular, centralized, codified. Yet Napoleon knew law alone could not anchor loyalty. Stability required symbols. He needed a new aristocracy, one that could replace the exiled, broken nobility of the Ancien regime. So in 1808 he created the imperial nobility. But this was no return to bloodlines. It was a nobility of service, not of birth. Titles of count, baron and duke were given not to ancient families but to generals, judges, administrators, scholars, and officials who had served the state with distinction. They were rewarded with lands, stipends, pensions, but above all, with a place in the hierarchy of order, a rung in the new vertical of power, and for them were forged new symbols, coats of arms, seals, mantles, ceremonial receptions. The imperial court became a mirror of monarchy, but stripped of dynasties, of inherited privilege, of the exclusivity of old clans. It was nobility remade in the image of Napoleon. And around this nobility, a legend began to grow. The old saying that every soldier carried a marshal's baton in his knapsack now found new life in the form of titles, orders, and decorations. With them flourished the empire's propaganda. Painters portrayed Napoleon not as a statesman, but as a hero of antiquity. Writers likened him to Caesar, to Alexander. In school books he was taught as the nation's saviour. Coins bore his profile. Portraits of the emperor adorned town halls and courtrooms. It was more than governance. It was image. Authority became not only efficient but infallible. During these years, schools and lycées spread across France, all placed under the hand of the state. Education became an instrument, moulding citizens of the empire. History, literature, law. Everything was oriented toward loyalty, discipline, reverence for order. Universities fell under ministerial control. New schools for engineers and administrators arose, preparing officers, jurists, and technocrats. Fewer and fewer careers began in the church or in family patronage. More and more began in service to the state. By 1807, the empire had become a finely tuned machine. Its economy was growing, trade expanding, finance secure. Provinces were ruled with precision. The army stood as both sword and symbol, its organisation strict, its drills relentless, its reputation mythic. At the summit stood a man not addressed as Your Majesty, but simply as Sire, the Emperor. And yet beneath the polished order beat a restless, urgent rhythm. The machine turned on the energy of one man. Nothing escaped his hand. He signed hundreds of decrees daily, involved himself in lawsuits, architectural projects, curricula, even complaints about bread. All power flowed through him. It gave an aura of invincibility, but it also bred fragility. For what could endure if the single source faltered? Meanwhile, beyond the borders, storms were gathering. A new coalition loomed. Economic war with Britain deepened. Napoleon's ambitions pushed outward, beyond Europe itself. The calm glitter of Paris masked the rising tension in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. And nowhere was the anxiety sharper than in Prussia. That kingdom, long neutral, now watched France's influence swell across the Rhine, creeping ever closer to its own frontiers. King Frederick William III was a hesitant man, cautious and slow by nature. For months he wavered, caught between fear and pride, yet his court, filled with generals and fiery nationalists, urged him forward. They spoke of honour, of balance, of Prussia's duty to Europe. Prussia had stood aside during the Third Coalition. Now, her statesmen argued, she held the moral right to intervene, to restore equilibrium. But what truly stung was Napoleon's bold intrusion into Berlin's sphere of influence. The Confederation of the Rhine included lands Prussia had once counted as its own clients. And then came the final insult. In August 1806, Napoleon, without so much as a consultation, annexed the Duchy of Clevesburg and handed it to his brother-in-law Joachim Murat. To the Prussian court it was a slap across the face. In October, war was declared. Confident in their old glories, the Prussians marched. They carried with them the memory of Frederick the Great, the aura of past victories. But memory is not strategy. Confidence is not preparation. Their army had not faced the test of modern war. Napoleon did not wait for them. With the Grande Armée, he surged northward. His method was unchanged. Speed, concentration, a strike to the enemy's rear. By mid-October, French columns closed in on the Prussian forces near the towns of Jena and Auerstedt. On October 14, 1806, two battles ignited at once. History would join their names, Jena-Auerstedt, but they were separate storms, fought in parallel. At Jena, Napoleon himself commanded. Facing him stood the Duke of Brunswick, aged and hesitant, his decisions muddled and slow. The battle began at dawn, the lines shifting back and forth. But by noon, Napoleon hurled in his reserves. The French line surged forward. The Prussians broke. Retreat became rout. At Auerstedt, the drama was sharper still. Marshal Davout, with only 26,000 men, stood against more than 60,000 Prussians. By all logic, he should have been crushed. Yet discipline, artillery fire, and the unyielding resolve of his infantry carried the day. The Prussian host faltered, recoiled, collapsed. By evening, the scale of disaster was plain. In a single day, Prussia's pride was shattered, her armies destroyed, her spirit broken. Napoleon advanced without pause. Soon he entered Berlin. For weeks he imposed his order. Arsenals seized, roads and bridges claimed, soldiers quartered in barracks, palaces, even museums. The city that had once embodied Prussia's stern spirit became a staging ground for future wars. But Napoleon did not stop with soldiers and steel. In Berlin, he announced one of his most important political and economic acts. It was the Berlin Decree, signed in late October 1806. Its words struck not at a battlefield, but at the heart of Britain's power, commerce. France declared the island kingdom under total blockade. All ports under French control and those of her allies were closed to British ships. Trade with England was outlawed. Letters, cargoes, vessels, all were to be seized. The decree demanded a choice even from neutral nations, either trade with France or with London, but never with both. Thus began the Continental Blockade, a colossal economic war aimed not at muskets or cannon, but at markets and merchants. Napoleon could not destroy Britain's fleet at sea, but perhaps by cutting her from Europe's harbours, he could strangle her empire of trade. On paper, the system looked ironclad. In practice, it demanded enormous effort. Customs patrols, coastal surveillance, spies among merchants and diplomats, confiscations, penalties, repression of violators. Some states resisted. Others, like Russia, agreed formally, but evaded the rules through neutral intermediaries. Smugglers thrived in shadowed coves. Yet the gesture mattered. Symbolically, Napoleon had declared war not on a state but on a global economy. While the blockade spread, the emperor pressed his campaign. What remained of Prussia's broken armies fell back toward Poland, where Russian reinforcements gathered. The war with Prussia was already shifting into war with Russia. The stage was set for a new and harsher trial. By the winter of 1806, France stood at the heart of northern Europe. Prussia lay prostrate, its capital occupied, its armies scattered, its king in flight. But Napoleon's triumph was incomplete. The true adversary, the one for whom the Fourth Coalition had been forged, had not yet entered the field. Russia under Alexander I was drawing her legions together in the east, across the snowy plains of Old Poland. He was determined to halt the spread of Napoleon's system. The winter campaign promised to be brutal. For Napoleon's army, exhausted by Jena and the long marches across Saxony, the land itself became an enemy. Harsh climate, frozen roads, scarce supplies. Europe's geography resisted no less than her soldiers, and yet the emperor refused to wait for spring. He pushed forward, determined to strike before the Russians could settle their strength. By the opening of 1807, the French columns were already advancing into the northeast. In January, the first great clash came at the Battle of Jankow, where Marshal Bennigsen commanded the Russian army. He fought stubbornly, retreating in good order, slipping from Napoleon's grasp. The emperor pursued, eager to trap and destroy, but the Russians evaded him. By February they chose their ground near the small town of Preußisch Eylau, a bleak place ringed with frozen fields. What followed, from the 7th to the 8th of February 1807, would become one of the darkest episodes of Napoleon's career. The battle began in blinding snow. Blizzard winds hid movements, cannons sank into drifts, men struggled even to see the shapes before them. More than 100,000 soldiers faced each other, and against Napoleon stood not only Russia's ranks, but winter itself. The first day was chaos. French columns hurled themselves at the centre of the Russian line, only to be met with grim resistance. Artillery fire muffled into the snow, cannonballs lodged in ice, cavalry charges dissolved against steady infantry. The fighting bled across villages and farmsteads, contested foot by foot. By evening, Napoleon realised he could not break them. Night fell with the dead lying thick across the fields. Temperatures plunged lower still. Soldiers slept pressed together on the frozen ground. Some never woke. At dawn, the French were exhausted, their spirits stretched thin. Then, suddenly, salvation arrived. Marshal Davout's corps marching in from the south. Their presence renewed the assault, igniting a second wave. But even with this force, the Russians were not broken. Bennigsen withdrew in order, yielding the field but preserving his army. The losses were staggering. More than 20,000 dead, wounded or missing on each side. The snow was stained black and crimson. Napoleon, who so often magnified his triumphs, spoke little of this day. It was no clear victory, and perhaps the first time he grasped the true nature of war in the East. Against Russia, battles would not be measured by speed or surprise alone. They would be measured in endurance, in blood, in silence beneath falling snow. By spring 1807, the struggle resumed. The Russian army entrenched itself once more. The French pressed forward, hampered by broken roads, poor supply, sickness, and fatigue. Yet Napoleon drove them on. He knew time was the enemy. If Russia were not struck down swiftly, other powers, Prussia, Sweden, might intervene. Only a decisive battle could end the campaign and reshape the map of Eastern Europe. That moment came on June 14, 1807. At Friedland, the Russians, confident in their numbers and their spirit, chose at last to attack. Marshal Bennigsen sought to seize initiative, yet in his boldness he made a fatal mistake. He placed his army with a river at its back. Should fortune fail, retreat would be chaos. Napoleon saw it instantly. He knew the shape of disaster before it unfolded, and he struck to make it real. French artillery opened first, pounding Russian positions with relentless precision. Infantry advanced in waves, bayonets flashing through smoke. Cavalry swept wide, slashing off the roads to retreat. By afternoon, Bennigsen's troops surged toward the bridges across the Aller. Panic spread. The crossing splintered under the crush. Wagons tumbled, horses screamed, men were swallowed by the current. Russia lost more than 20,000. The French bled too, but theirs was the triumph. Friedland was not a stalemate like Eylau. It was a decision, final and complete. The Fourth Coalition collapsed with it. Alexander thus understood. To fight on would invite ruin, and so he agreed to parley. The place chosen was itself a symbol. Tilsit, a border town divided by the Niemen River. On its waters they built a floating pavilion, half French, half Russian, yet belonging to neither. Here Napoleon and Alexander met face to face. The record of their words is scant, but witnesses spoke of respect, even warmth. Alexander, youthful, charming, fluent in French, captivated. Napoleon, measured, self-made, radiating power, impressed in turn. Two worlds seemed to mirror each other. Empire born of tradition, empire born of revolution. Out of this encounter came the Treaties of Tilsit, signed in July 1807. Russia withdrew from war and more. It became, in effect, France's partner. Alexander pledged to join the continental blockade, closing his ports to Britain. In return, Napoleon promised not to meddle in Russia's east, to recognise her dominion there. But if Russia gained respect, Prussia was broken. The treaties carved it in half. Much of its land was stripped away. Out of Polish soil rose the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, independent in name, but in truth a French outpost. King Frederick William was left humiliated, forced to wait in shadow for his turn to bow before Napoleon. By Tilsit, France had reached its zenith. From the Atlantic to the Vistula, from Hamburg to Naples, the empire stretched unbroken. French was the language of law, the Code Napoleon its spine, French canon its heartbeat. Napoleon had achieved what once seemed impossible. He had redrawn the map of Europe, divided the continent with Russia, and forced the old world into a new order. Yet behind the grandeur, shadows lengthened. The blockade against Britain faltered. Smugglers multiplied. In Spain, discontent grew, and Alexander of Russia, though bound by treaty, had no intention of living forever under Paris's shadow. Still, outwardly, the empire triumphed. Soldiers marched to the call of trumpets. Convoys rumbled westward, carrying grain and gold. For a moment Europe seemed frozen, as if history itself had ended. But history does not end. It turns, and its wheel was beginning again. After Tilsit, Napoleon's empire appeared unshakable. Peace with Russia in the east, Prussia humbled in the north, Italy loyal in the south. Only one enemy remained beyond his grasp, Great Britain. The island kingdom defied him still. Neither blockade nor fleet nor diplomacy could break it. Determined to choke Britain's lifeblood, Napoleon pressed the continental system harder. Every nation of Europe, ally or neutral, was to sever trade with London. But there was one country that refused to comply: Portugal. Bound by ancient ties to Britain, its royal family ignored Napoleon's demands, allowing contraband to flow beneath the blockade. To bring Portugal to heel, the French would need to pass through Spain. Spain, in theory, was an ally. But its king, Charles IV, was old, weak, and overshadowed by his despised favourite, Manuel Godoy. At first, French troops entered Spain under the guise of cooperation, a joint expedition against Portugal. Yet soon the mask slipped. Town by town, fortress by fortress, Napoleon's soldiers took possession, as though Spain were not an ally but a prize. In Paris these moves seemed but another step toward a continental empire. In Madrid they looked like betrayal. Among the people, humiliation simmered. The nobility felt unease, the army bewilderment. Then the Spanish monarchy itself fractured. A feud broke open between Charles IV and his ambitious son Ferdinand. Napoleon saw opportunity. He summoned both to Bayonne, just across the border in France. There, under pressure and threat, Charles was forced to abdicate. Ferdinand, who had already proclaimed himself king, was stripped of his claim as well. Spain's throne lay empty. Napoleon filled it with blood of his own. He offered the crown to his brother Joseph, until then ruler of Naples. In theory, France had gained another allied monarchy. In practice, it had opened the gates to its most ruinous war. Joseph's coronation in Madrid did not inspire, it ignited. On May 2nd, 1808, the city exploded. Crowds surged through the streets, striking French garrisons, killing officers, torching barracks. For the first time in years of conquest, Napoleon's army met not another army, but a people. Marshal Joachim Murat, commanding in Spain, answered with steel. His order was merciless. No leniency, no restraint. The boulevards of Madrid ran with blood. Captives were executed publicly. Firing squads worked until dusk. The horror seared itself into memory, immortalized in paintings, whispered in prayers. But Madrid was only the spark. The fire spread. Zaragoza, Valencia, Seville, all rose. From towns and villages, mountains and plains, resistance surged like a tide. This was not war as the French understood it. It was something new, something raw. A war without front lines. Farmers took up axes, monks carried muskets. Former soldiers, merchants, beggars, even children with rifles hidden in cloaks, all became enemies. The French marched in columns, but their columns bled from shadows. Bridges exploded behind them. Convoys vanished on narrow roads. Barricades appeared overnight in villages thought pacified. The invaders' every step became dangerous. Joseph Bonaparte sat upon the throne of Spain, but his throne was a fortress under siege. Beyond Madrid's walls, his crown was only paper. Even French victories changed little. At Ocaña, at Medellin, their generals crushed Spanish forces. But when the battalions marched on, the land swallowed their triumphs. Guerrillas returned, retaking ground, reclaiming villages, killing the stragglers, and repression, brutal and indiscriminate, only deepened the hatred. Each execution made martyrs. Each burned town gave rise to new fighters. Spain became less a conquest than a curse, a black hole within the empire, drawing men, draining strength. Then came Britain. A small army landed, disciplined, professional, led by General Arthur Wellesley, the man who would become the Duke of Wellington. Though modest in size, his force was precise, coordinated. He worked with the insurgents, built supply lines, kept order where chaos thrived. Month by month the war dragged on. Napoleon's generals fought not just Spaniards but the land itself. The ridges of Cantabria, the forests of Asturias, the plains of Extremadura. Always ambushed, always resisted. At last, the Emperor himself came. In late 1808, Napoleon crossed into Spain to lead his soldiers. He struck swiftly, winning battles at Espinosa and Somosierra, reclaiming Madrid in triumph. But even his presence could not change the truth. Victories came, yes, yet each was fleeting, each more costly than the last. Spain was a wound that would not close. Meanwhile, within France, unrest began to stir. Coffins returned from the peninsula. Mothers wept. Fathers cursed the distant war. Spain became a symbol of futility, of endless sacrifice, of a people who could not be subdued. For the first time in his reign, the emperor faced questions he could not easily silence. Why was this war fought? Why did his brother sit upon a throne hated by its own people? And what future could such a crown hold? The heroes of this struggle were not only French. Across Europe the names of Spaniards became legends. General Castaños, Father Mendizábal, the guerrillero Juan Martín. They were celebrated as patriots, woven into ballads, painted on canvases, immortalized in stories of defiance. The narrative was not one of submission but of liberation. By 1810, the war dragged on with no end in sight. Spain did not collapse, yet it did not win outright. France did not lose, but neither did it rule. The stalemate was a fracture in Napoleon's empire, small yet dangerous, invisible at first glance but undermining its very foundations. Spain had revealed a truth. Even the greatest army of Europe could be rendered powerless if an entire nation rose against it. And yet, outwardly, Napoleon's dominion still shone. By 1812, his empire stretched wider than any since the age of Charlemagne. From the Atlantic to the Vistula, from the Baltic to Naples, the map bore his mark. French law governed Warsaw and Vienna. His prefects oversaw Holland and northern Italy. Thrones in Europe held his brothers, his marshals, his trusted men. In Paris there was splendour, parades, balls, soaring architecture, newspapers filled with praise, the steady beat of military marches echoing through boulevards. At first glance the empire was invulnerable, but beneath, the strain was growing. The continental blockade meant to strangle Britain had turned inward, strangling the empire itself. Smuggling flourished, prices rose and fell, provinces murmured. Holland grumbled, Germany chafed, and Spain bled endlessly. Recruitment grew harsher. Boys were pressed into service, sent south or east to die in wars no longer understood. Napoleon himself, though he seemed unshakable, felt the pressure. He had ceased to be a revolutionary long ago. Now he was an emperor in the old sense, concerned with dynasty, with legitimacy, with the permanence of his creation. And from that concern arose one of the most painful decisions of his life, to divorce Josephine. Josephine de Beauharnais, his first wife, the woman he had adored with a passion both tender and consuming, could not give him an heir. For years he had postponed, hoping the doctors were wrong, hoping fate would relent. But by 1809 the truth was undeniable. If his empire was to endure beyond him, he must have a son. The announcement at court was solemn, not sorrowful. Divorce was declared not as tragedy but as decree, a cold act of political will. Josephine was not abandoned to poverty. Her dignity remained intact. Yet their bond, once forged in passion and letters of longing, was broken forever. Soon after he secured another union, this time with Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor. It was more than marriage. It was legitimacy. Through her, Napoleon stepped into the circle of Europe's ancient dynasties. No longer an outsider risen from the revolution's fire, he now stood as their equal. In 1811, a child was born, Napoleon II, the long-awaited heir. For the emperor, this was destiny fulfilled. His dynasty was no longer a dream but a fact, a new world in which he was not usurper but lawful sovereign. And yet, as his star blazed at its brightest, shadows gathered, alliances frayed. Austria, allied by marriage, remained cool and wary. Prussia, humiliated and burdened with indemnities, waited silently for the chance to break free. Britain's fleet commanded the seas, strangling trade. Italy stirred with unrest, and in the east, Russia. Though bound at Tilsit, Alexander them had never truly been a willing partner. The continental blockade choked Russia's lifeblood, commerce with Britain, vital for its northern ports. Worse still, the Duchy of Warsaw, raised upon the bones of Poland, loomed as a threat to St. Petersburg itself. By 1811, the alliance had grown brittle. By the spring of 1812, it was stretched to breaking. Napoleon decided to strike first. He gathered the mightiest host Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men drawn from across the continent. French, Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, even Austrians marched beneath his banners. It was more than an army. It was a statement, a living monument to imperial will. He believed, as he had so many times before, that a single swift campaign would suffice. A blow like Austerlitz, like Jena, like Wagram. A quick battle, a forced negotiation, a treaty sealed with French ink. On June 22nd, 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Niemen and entered Russian soil. But the familiar pattern did not unfold. The Russian forces, divided under Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, refused to fight. They retreated deeper into the vastness, leaving behind villages burned, granaries destroyed, wells poisoned. Civilians melted into the forests, taking with them livestock, tools, food. It was the strategy of scorched earth. Napoleon longed for battle, but none was offered. His soldiers marched through silence, through ashes. Every step drained strength, not through bullets, but through emptiness. The baggage trains fell behind. Provisions dwindled. Equipment was abandoned by the roadside. Days of blistering heat gave way to freezing nights, and in the reports, words repeated with growing dread: dysentery, hunger, mutiny. Even within the Russian command there was discord. Barclay urged continued retreat, arguing that time was Russia's ally. Bagration and many generals clamoured for confrontation. At last, under pressure from army and society alike, Tsar Alexander appointed a new commander, Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov. Kutuzov was no rash gambler. He knew when to yield and when to strike. But he also knew this: if the army abandoned Moscow without a fight, the nation itself might collapse. The village lay on a landscape shaped for battle, rivers cutting through valleys, gentle hills rising above fields, open spaces wide enough for artillery fire, forests and clearings for cover. It was the final line where Russia could stand. Kutuzov knew it. His engineers dug trenches, carved redoubts, buried cannons deep in the earth. At the heart of the defence stood the Raevsky redoubt. On the flanks, the Bagration flèches and the Semenovskaya positions, crude fortresses of earth and timber waiting to be baptized in fire. On September 7th, 1812, the cannons roared. The Battle of Borodino began with thunder. French guns rained iron for hours, until the air itself turned to smoke and ash. Then wave upon wave of attacks crashed against the Russian lines. The earth shook beneath cavalry charges. Men fell by thousands. Bagration, the Lion of Russia, was mortally wounded. Yet the lines held, bent but not broken. Kutuzov, weathered and watchful, kept his core intact. Napoleon stood with his guard, silent. He did not unleash them. Perhaps caution, perhaps calculation. The choice haunted him. For though the ground was won, the army before him still lived. 30 to 40,000 lay dead or wounded on each side. The field was victory in name, but not in truth. Moscow lay open. Yet when the emperor entered the city, it was not triumph he found, but silence. The streets were empty, houses abandoned, pantries bare, and then fire. At first in scattered quarters, then sweeping whole districts, flames devoured the wooden city. Roofs caved, walls crumbled, skies glowed crimson. Within days, Moscow became a skeleton of ash. The governor vanished, the fire brigades dismissed. Whether by chance or will, the city destroyed itself. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin. He expected envoys. He expected Alexander. He expected peace. None came. The Tsar remained silent. Weeks passed. Winter crept closer. Hunger spread. Horses collapsed in the streets. Disease prowled the ruins. The army, unprepared for the Russian night, withered. At last the order came: retreat. What followed was not a march, but a death. Snow-hardened roads into ice. The cold pierced through uniforms, through skin, through bone. Soldiers killed their mounts to eat, to clothe, to warm themselves by burning flesh. Cossacks struck like ghosts at the flanks. Partisans set fire to bridges, poisoned wells, hid grain beneath frozen earth. Every step west was paid in corpses. At the Berezina in November, the Grand Army, no longer grand, attempted to cross the river under fire. Engineers threw bridges across ice and flood. Men trampled one another in desperation. Cannons sank into black water. Soldiers vanished beneath sheets of ice. From 600,000, fewer than 50,000 returned. What staggered back across the Niemen was not an army, but shadows of an army. Not a force, but fragments of an idea. Napoleon survived, but his empire had begun to die. The catastrophe in Russia had consumed not only lives but belief itself. The aura of invincibility, the myth that Napoleon's star could never fall, vanished on the frozen steppes. In its place rose a dangerous idea: the emperor could be defeated. When, in December 1812, Napoleon abandoned the remnants of his shattered army and returned in secrecy to Paris, he walked into the Tuileries with the same force of will that had carried him from Corsica to coronation. He summoned the Council of State, assured France that all was under control, and proclaimed new mobilization. But the truth was harsh. France, drained and draped in mourning, was called once more to arms. Across villages and towns, boys barely out of childhood marched to the barracks. Many had no muskets, no uniforms, little training, yet they were to replace the veterans buried under Russian snows. Cynics called it the army of bearded schoolboys. To Napoleon, it was necessity. He knew Europe was gathering against him. He would strike first. In the spring of 1813, the French crossed the Rhine again. But this was no echo of Austerlitz or Jena. Against them now stood not one enemy, but a coalition reborn. Russia, relentless under Alexander VI's Prussia, once broken and humiliated, now risen from occupation and vengeance. Sweden too, led by an irony of fate, Crown Prince Bernadotte, a former Marshal of France, who now took up arms against his one-time master. Austria watched from the wings, weighing the moment. At first, Napoleon's genius still flickered. In Saxony, at Lutzen and Bautzen, he secured victories, yet they were defensive in nature, costly in blood, hollow in effect. They bought no surrender, opened no gates. The Allies asked for a pause, a truce. During those summer talks, the true abyss opened. The coalition demanded France retreat to the frontiers of 1791, to abandon Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, to relinquish the empire Napoleon had carved from the bones of monarchies. He refused. To yield was to erase himself. By August, the truce broke. Austria revealed its hand. Vienna, despite the bond of marriage, Maria Louisa, Napoleon's wife, daughter of Emperor Francis, cast its lot with the Allies. The noose tightened. Russia pressed from the east. Austria surged from the south. In Spain, Wellington's redcoats and guerrilla shadows bled French garrisons dry. From the north, Swedish and Prussian troops moved. Even in Germany, once subdued, the earth trembled. Universities whispered of liberty. Secret societies planned rebellion. Students, poets, philosophers, voices stirred with the language of nations rising. In cities, riots flared. French garrisons felt less like rulers and more like prisoners behind their own walls. By autumn, the tension reached breaking point. Napoleon's scattered victories, his raw recruits, his desperate proclamations could not hold the tide. A decisive clash loomed, immense, inescapable, and destined to mark the beginning of the end. It happened in October, near the city of Leipzig, a place where great rivers and roads converged like the threads of fate itself. On one side stood Napoleon, with roughly 200,000 men, weary, battered, yet still radiating the aura of the once invincible. On the other side, an ocean of enemies, 350,000 soldiers of the Sixth Coalition. Russians, Austrians, Prussians, Swedes. Even Saxon and Bavarian troops, once bound to France, now marched under banners of rebellion. For 4 days, the Battle of Leipzig, later known as the Battle of Nations, thundered across the plains. The first day was only a test, probing, holding. Napoleon's lines still clung to their ground. But with every sunrise, more enemy columns poured in, tightening the noose. By the third day, the air itself seemed to shake with the weight of an advancing world. When Napoleon realized the front could not be held, he ordered retreat. The night of October 19th, 1813, was filled with confusion and desperation as his troops crowded toward the bridges over the Elster River. Then, the fatal error. The bridge was blown too soon. Thousands were left stranded on the wrong bank. They fought. They drowned. They were cut down where they stood. Among the fallen was Marshal Józef Poniatowski, the only Pole ever raised to the dignity of Marshal of the Empire. Wounded, exhausted, he still charged with sabre in hand until, trying to swim across the river, he sank beneath the black waters. Leipzig was not just a defeat. It was a reckoning. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility cracked at last. Over 100,000 casualties marked the fields, but worse than the numbers was the shift in the air. France was no longer feared, but hunted. Through the winter, the great tapestry of Napoleon's Europe unravelled. Germany slipped away. Bavaria defected. Saxony followed. The Confederation of the Rhine, once his proud creation, crumbled overnight. In the Netherlands, Uprisings tore down imperial banners. In Switzerland, militias gathered to throw off the French yoke. Prussia raised its flag once more over Berlin. Austria reclaimed Tyrol, and even Italy began to smoulder with unrest. Napoleon retreated behind the Rhine. The emperor who had once dictated borders to kings now found his own empire reduced, shrinking toward France itself. And yet, he would not yield. In January 1814, the armies of the coalition crossed into France. Alexander Thurm advanced, Blücher pressed, Schwarzenberg surged, all converging toward Paris from different directions. It should have been the end. But Napoleon, as if defying fate itself, produced a final blaze of brilliance. In the campaign of 1814, he moved like quicksilver across the French countryside, slipping between massive enemy columns, striking with precision. At Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, his small forces broke larger ones apart. Each victory was like a ghostly echo of past glory, his officers and the old guard following him with the same fervour as in Italy, in Austerlitz, in Jena. For a fleeting moment it seemed as though he might conjure another miracle. But miracles had deserted him. The Allies pressed closer. Paris trembled. His armies were shadows drained of strength, recruits too young to hold the line. Mobilization no longer saved him. The nation was exhausted. The economy lay in ruins. And now, even within the chambers of France itself, the whispers grew louder. The Parliament began openly debating whether the emperor should be deposed. Old names, long buried, resurfaced. The Bourbons, banished, humiliated, forgotten, were being spoken of again in the salons of Paris. Napoleon felt the empire slipping not only on the battlefield, but in the very soul of France. March 31st, 1814. For the first time in living memory, Paris did not welcome its own banners of triumph. It was not French drums that shook the boulevards, but the march of foreign boots. The Allies entered the capital in silence heavy with history. Alexander Thirst of Russia rode at the head, solemn, without mockery, proclaiming not vengeance but peace. Yet for Parisians, long accustomed to parades of victory, this day felt like a funeral. The city itself had fallen. In Fontainebleau, Napoleon waited. A suffocating silence filled the palace. Generals came one by one, urging him to do the unthinkable. Abdicate. The Senate had already formed a provisional government. The people did not rise for him. Paris did not revolt. The empire stood alone. On April 6, 1814, after 2 weeks of struggle, Napoleon laid down the crown. At first he tried to hand it to his son, but the Allies refused, and so he signed a full abdication. He would remain emperor, but only of an island, not of France. They gave him Elba, a speck of land off the Tuscan coast, a mockery of empire. They allowed him a handful of guards, a small retinue, even a personal flag. On April 11th, he stood on the stone steps of Fontainebleau, facing the old guard. Tears welled in hardened soldiers' eyes as he embraced them one by one. His voice rang through the courtyard. "I thank you, soldiers. For years we marched together toward glory. Now I go into exile, but your name will live forever." Thus ended the First Empire, but not the story of Bonaparte. For Napoleon was not a man who could accept finality, so long as a single step still seemed possible. Spring 1814. Europe exhaled as if a storm had passed. The Bourbons returned, enthroned once more. In Vienna, under chandeliers and the glitter of cut crystal, monarchs began dividing the continent as though French drums had never shaken it. But over this fragile calm hung a shadow. Bonaparte was alive, and while he lived, Europe could not rest easy. On Elba, Napoleon was no prisoner, but a ruler in miniature. They left him the title, a court of a few dozen, a tiny guard, even cannon. He rode the island roads, inspecting bridges and fields, gazing always to the sea. His restless energy sought an outlet, drafting regulations, dictating letters, creating order in the smallest details. Yet his eyes never left France. For beyond the waves, everything was changing. Louis XVI, restored to the throne, sought to reconcile, to appear gentle, a monarch of moderation. But between him and his people yawned a gulf. Imperial officers were cast aside. Veterans felt forgotten. The flags and honours of empire vanished from squares and walls. Revolutionary ideals and Napoleonic victories were being erased. The people felt cold. The army felt betrayed. And in that wound, Napoleon saw not exile, but opportunity. Because while Europe tried to convince itself the story was over, the truth was far darker. Bonaparte was alive, and while he breathed, the world could never truly feel safe. Napoleon followed the shifting tides in France with restless attention. He studied reports, absorbed rumours, and sensed the growing agitation among the people. He knew that if he set foot on French soil once more, he would not face resistance. Convinced of this, he acted. In February 1815, he left Elba with a modest retinue. Roughly 1,000 men, mostly veterans of the Imperial Guard, several officers, 1 or 2 doctors, and a handful of aides de camp. Their vessel made landfall on the southern coast of France. On March 1st, in the Gulf of Juan, Napoleon stepped ashore. He did not march with an army. He carried with him the memory of past victories. Soldiers dispatched to arrest him crossed over instead, joining his ranks. At Grenoble, he stood before a battalion drawn up against him and declared, "If you wish to shoot your emperor, here I stand." No muskets were raised. Instead, men rushed forward, shouting his name, some in tears. He advanced through the country like the living embodiment of past glory, and that phantom quickly solidified into reality. Louis XV fled Paris. On March 20th, scarcely 20 days after Napoleon's landing, he re-entered the Tuileries Palace. He was emperor once again. What followed, later called the 100 Days, became a season of desperate hope. Napoleon proclaimed a new, more liberal constitution, announced amnesty, and summoned his veterans back to service. He knew that the absolute power of old was no longer possible. Now he aimed to unify the fractured nation. In some ways, he succeeded. Yet for the rest of Europe there were no illusions left. The monarchs assembled in Vienna regarded his return not as a plea of despair, but as a challenge. The exile they had overthrown now stood before them once more, and this meant only one thing. He had to be destroyed completely. The Allied powers reorganised at once. To the northeast, German states and Austria concentrated their armies. In the south, British forces pressed on from Spain. In Belgium, the Duke of Wellington established his corps, while near Namur and Wavre the Prussians gathered under Field Marshal Blücher. Napoleon chose not to wait for their strike. He marched north, determined to strike before they could unite, defeating each force separately. His strategy echoed his earlier triumphs: swift advance, fragmented enemy fronts, decisive victory. On June 16th at Ligny, he engaged and defeated Blücher's army. Yet the victory was incomplete, for the Prussians retreated in good order, preserving their strength. 2 days later, on June 18th, Napoleon faced Wellington near the village of Waterloo. The battle raged for an entire day. French cavalry, magnificent and desperate, charged again and again with unyielding ferocity. The Imperial Guard stood unbroken until the very last moment, their muskets cracking, their banners still aloft in the smoke. Flanks shifted hands repeatedly in bloody confusion, but the British lines refused to bend. They endured, anchored upon the ridges, their discipline absorbing each wave. Then came the moment of destiny. Across the horizon, fresh formations appeared. Those very troops that had retreated earlier at Ligny. Now they re-entered the field, not as fugitives, but as executioners. They fell upon Napoleon's flank with crushing inevitability. Sensing the collapse, Napoleon cast his final dice. He committed the Old Guard, the legendary veterans of Italy, of Austerlitz, of the Pyramids. These were the men who had never failed him, men trained to perfection, men who believed themselves invincible. They marched into the storm, drums beating, eagles glittering through the haze, but even they could not shift the weight of the tide. Volley after volley broke their advance. Their lines buckled, then began to waver. When at last the Old Guard pulled back, a shudder passed across the field. Whispers spread like fire. The guard retreats. That single phrase was enough. It was the death knell of the Grande Armée. Cohesion dissolved. What had been an army became a scattering of fugitives. Retreat turned to rout, rout to chaos. France was left naked, defenceless. Napoleon returned to Paris, but Paris was no longer the city that had once crowned him. It was not awaiting victory, it was waiting for the end. Only 4 days after Waterloo, on June 22nd, 1815, he abdicated once again. This time there was no talk of his son inheriting, no dream of dynasty. He merely asked to be left in peace. He thought of fleeing to America, anywhere beyond the reach of vengeance. But the British Navy locked every port, sealed every passage. At last, in resignation, he surrendered to a British captain, trusting in honour, perhaps in mercy. But England chose another fate. They did not bring him in triumph to London. They did not hand him back to France. Instead, they condemned him to a living grave, the remote rock of St. Helena, adrift in the Atlantic 1,000 miles from any shore. A barren island, treeless, windswept, guarded by redcoats, a place designed not for kings, but for oblivion. And so the great drama ended not with a glorious death on the battlefield, but with exile. His sword replaced by ink and memory, his empire reduced to recollections scrawled in the silence of captivity. When the British ship Northumberland slipped its anchor and steered southward, the decision was sealed. Napoleon no longer belonged to France, nor to Europe, nor even to history in the making. He was already passing into history remembered, into the long corridors of reflection, regret, and slow extinction. The voyage lasted 2 months. Summer of 1815 he spent enclosed in his cabin, staring at the endless horizon. When the ship crossed the equator, sailors held their traditional ceremonies, laughing, cheering, marking the moment. He did not join them. He knew this was no journey at sea. It was his own funeral procession, conducted while he still breathed. At last, St. Helena emerged, bleak cliffs against a restless ocean, lashed by gales, cut off from the world. The island was exactly as the British had intended, isolated, inescapable, merciless. He disembarked in October 1815 and was lodged in Longwood House, a grim, wind-battered residence perched upon a plateau. From its windows no ships could be seen upon the horizon. From there he would watch the last embers of his life fade. It was a prison without bars, an island fortress designed not by walls or iron, but by the merciless geography of the South Atlantic. There was no escape. Around him remained only a few loyal shadows, officers, servants, doctors who chose exile over comfort. General Bertrand, Marshal Gourgaud, the faithful Las Cases. Las Cases became his first confidant, his silent chronicler. In the long evenings, while the wind howled beyond shuttered windows and rain clawed at the house, Napoleon dictated his memories. He spoke of Toulon, of Egypt, of Marengo and Austerlitz. His voice, no longer commanding armies, now commanded history itself. He reconstructed his life not as a defeated exile, but as destiny incarnate. He debated not with enemies, but with posterity. He defended his choices, justified his failures, recasted his victories. For Napoleon, this was the last campaign, not of muskets and cannons, but of memory, a battle for the image that would endure after his body failed. And in this battle he would not yield. Yet time itself was the enemy no general could outmaneuver. The damp climate gnawed at his bones. Food was poor, nerves frayed, nights sleepless. Above all loomed the figure of Hudson Lowe, the rigid British governor who measured every step, every letter, every breath. From this iron cage of surveillance grew irritation, depression, and a sense of betrayal. Letters home revealed a man increasingly haunted by solitude. He complained of Europe's treachery, of France's ingratitude, of the world's injustice. He read endlessly, Cicero, Tacitus, Plutarch, losing himself in ancient lives as if searching for mirrors of his own. He walked slowly in the garden, pacing under dripping leaves, or sat by the window staring at the fog that swallowed sea and sky alike. The emperor lived in the past, but his thoughts bent toward the future. He predicted revolutions, new wars, new tides of history. Even in decay, his mind remained imperial, but spring of 1821 brought collapse. His body betrayed him. The doctors suspected stomach cancer, the same illness that had claimed his father. Agonizing symptoms tore through his last months, weight vanishing, fevers consuming him, the very act of eating turning into torment. In those final weeks, the once tireless general barely rose from bed. No dictations, no walks, only fading breaths and whispered fragments. On May 5th, 1821, in the afternoon light, he asked to hear his will. In it, he begged to rest not on this lonely rock but on the banks of the Seine, among the people he swore he had always loved. Toward evening, consciousness slipped away. His last words, recorded by witnesses, floated like broken banners of memory. France, army, vanguard, Josephine. He died far from the land he'd remade, far from the legions he had once commanded. No glory, no flags, no thunder of cannon salutes. Only a humble coffin, a willow tree for shade, a grave without monument, without inscription. Not even his name, just silence, just earth, just the line, "Here lies." And yet, even this silence would not last. His rest was only temporary. 20 years after his death, in 1840, France obtained the right to bring Napoleon's remains back home. It was not merely a funeral procession, it was a national rite of memory. A black-draped barge glided along the Seine, adorned with golden ornaments, carrying the coffin of the man who once ruled Europe. On the riverbanks, millions gathered. Paris wept and celebrated at the same time. The streets were covered with flags. Veterans of forgotten campaigns recalled their youth, and young boys wore miniature uniforms pretending to be grenadiers of the Guard. It was not just the return of a body, it was the return of a legend. He was laid to rest in the Hôtel des Invalides, in a monumental crypt beneath a colossal dome, a place where even architecture seemed to bow before his name. Thus ended the earthly journey of a man who began as an obscure artillery officer from Corsica and became the very symbol of Europe's most turbulent era. He was adored and hated, feared and cursed, but he was never forgotten. For as later generations would say, Napoleon was not merely a man, he was an epoch that fought against eternity itself. He lived only 51 years, fewer than many rulers, fewer than countless generals. But within that brief span, he crammed what would have taken others centuries. He rose like a storm and fell with thunderous force. He was both the pupil of artillery and the master of Europe. He was an exile and a lawgiver, a dictator and a reformer. In him lived cruelty and genius, cold calculation, and a burning faith in destiny. He left no dynasty, no stable system, no lasting inheritance of peace. But he left behind an age. After him, nothing was the same. War was different. Politics was different. Europe was different. He destroyed the old order, but in its ruins he planted the seeds of new ideas. Equality before the law, civil liberties, the right of talent to rise. Centuries have passed, yet the debate over him endures. For some, he remains a despot and usurper. For others, a genius and a hero. For all he is a riddle, one to which history returns again and again. Empires crumble, monuments collapse, but the story of a man who dared to defy the entire world still stands.